They called him the Iron Dragon of Seoul. Seo Dong-Hyuk was a man who believed mercy was a defect, a weakness that got people killed. His private residence was more than a home. It was a sanctuary where his rules were absolute. Rule number 1. No outsiders, no exceptions. But on a rain-slicked Monday evening, Mina, his head of staff, shattered that rule. She had smuggled a small, trembling boy named Seo into the servants' quarters, hiding him from the violent debt collectors tearing through the city streets. When Dong-Hyuk stormed into the room, his tailored black suit sharp enough to cut, he didn't find an assassin. He found a 6-year-old child clutching a tattered teddy bear, sobbing in the corner. Behind him, his bodyguards moved like shadows, their weapons raised, cold steel glinting in the dim light. Mina threw herself in front of the boy, shielding his small body with her own, begging for a mercy she knew Dong-Hyuk didn't possess. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sound of a gunshot. But instead she heard the heavy thud of a weapon hitting the floor. She looked up, breathless. The most feared man in South Korea was frozen, his hand trembling as he reached for the boy's wrist. His eyes were locked on a small, crimson birthmark, a mark he hadn't seen in 20 years. Tears, hot and unbidden, blurred his vision. "Brother?" he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in his life. Why would the Iron Dragon of Seoul drop his gun and weep at the sight of a poor maid's ward? What is the secret behind that birthmark? Drop your predictions in the comments. Hit like if you're hooked and subscribe so you don't miss the truth that follows. 10 p.m. The heavy iron gates of the Seo estate groaned open as a black sedan pulled in, but inside the staff kitchen Mina's world was already ending. The burner on the stove hissed, but she couldn't hear it over the sound of her own heartbeat. 2 hours earlier her phone had screamed to life. It was a contact from the old neighborhood, the Gray District. A raid was happening. Loan sharks were kicking down doors looking for collateral, and Seo's mother, Mina's only sister, had been taken. The caller's voice was a jagged whisper. "They're coming for the boy next, Mina. They want to sell his debt. You have to get him out. Now." Mina had stood in the middle of the most expensive kitchen in Seoul, her feet rooted to the marble floor. She had no apartment of her own. She lived in the dragon's lair, a place where even a misplaced shadow could result in a firing or worse. Her sister had been her only bridge to a normal life, the one person who remembered Mina before she became a silent ghost in a Mafia mansion. She remembered the day Seo was born, the tiny red mark on his wrist that the doctors called a fluke of nature, but her mother had called a mark of the stars. With nowhere to run and the sirens wailing in the distance, Mina had made the most dangerous choice of her life. She had brought the boy through the service entrance, tucked him under a laundry cart, and prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the boss wouldn't return until morning. But Seo Dong-Hyuk always knew when his sanctuary was breached. And now the boy was sitting in the dark, confused, clutching a bear with a missing eye, not knowing that the man standing over him was the very monster the world feared most. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seo estate, sounding like 1,000 frantic fingers tapping on glass. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the suffocating silence of a graveyard. Mina stood in the center of the industrial-grade kitchen, her breath hitching in her chest as she stared at her phone. The screen was cracked, a jagged spiderweb across the text that had just shattered her life. "They took her, Mina. The debt collectors, they're sweeping the Gray District. They're looking for the boy. Run." Mina felt the world tilt. Her sister was gone, dragged into the back of some windowless van because of a debt that was never hers to begin with. But Seo, little innocent Seo, was still out there. She could almost see him in her mind, huddled in the corner of their shared tenement, clutching that ragged teddy bear with the missing eye, waiting for a mother who wasn't coming home. In the world of the Iron Dragon, there were no second chances. Seo Dong-Hyuk didn't just fire people, he erased them. He had built his throne on a foundation of absolute isolation. His mansion was his fortress, a place where no one entered without a retinal scan and a background check that went back 3 generations. To bring an outsider here, to bring a child here, wasn't just a breach of contract. It was a death sentence. But as the sirens wailed in the distance, closer now, echoing through the smog-filled streets of Seoul, Mina didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw her nephew's wide, terrified eyes. She moved like a woman possessed. She stripped off her formal maid's apron and threw on a heavy coat, slipping out the service entrance into the downpour. The drive to the gray district was a blur of neon lights and splashing puddles. When she found him, Seo was exactly where she feared, under the kitchen table, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. He didn't ask questions. He just reached for her, his small fingers digging into her sleeve. "Auntie," he whimpered, "where's mommy?" "Shoo," Minna whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We're going to a safe place. A palace, Seo. But you have to be a ghost. Can you do that for me? Can you be a little ghost?" Getting him back into the mansion was a dance with the devil. She used the laundry delivery as a distraction, tucking the small boy beneath a mountain of heavy, starched linens. Her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird as she pushed the cart past the silent black-suited guards. Every squeak of the wheels sounded like an alarm. Every breath she took felt like stolen air. Finally, she reached the staff quarters, a tiny windowless room that felt like a prison cell, but tonight, it was a sanctuary. She lifted the linens and pulled Seo out. He looked so small against the cold, sterile backdrop of the estate. "Stay here," she pleaded, kneeling so she was eye level with him. "Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, don't come out." She watched him huddle on her narrow cot, pulling his teddy bear to his chest. He looked so fragile, so out of place in a house built on blood and iron. Minna stepped back, closing the door softly. She had broken the dragon's first law. Now all she could do was pray that the monster stayed in his lair. The sanctuary of the Seo estate was never truly silent. It hummed with the low, predatory vibration of security systems and the distant, rhythmic footfalls of men who lived for violence. But tonight that rhythm was broken. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary study swung open with a violent force that made the air in the room recoil. Seo Dong-Hyuk stepped inside, his black overcoat slick with rain, looking every bit the Iron Dragon, who had just finished incinerating a rival's ambition. He stopped dead. His sharp, predatory eyes didn't miss the slight tremor of the curtain or the small, mud-stained sneaker peeking out from behind his desk. Minna was there in an instant, her face a mask of waxen terror, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Sir," she gasped, her voice barely a thread of sound. "Please." There was nowhere else. The raids. They were going to take him. Dong-Hyuk didn't listen. His rules were the only thing that kept the chaos of his soul at bay, and they had been violated. With a slow, chilling precision, he reached into his holster. The click of the safety being disengaged echoed like a crack of thunder in the small space. Behind him, 3 bodyguards filled the doorway, their own weapons raised in a practiced, lethal formation. "Out," Dong-Hyuk commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Minna threw herself onto the floor, her forehead hitting the wood. "He's just a child. He's 6 years old, he doesn't know anything." From behind the desk, a small, choked sob broke the tension. Seo crawled out, clutching his teddy bear so hard the stuffing began to leak from its seams. The boy looked up, his face streaked with salt and grime, his eyes wide with a fear that no child should ever know. As the red laser sights from the guards' weapons began to dance across the boy's small chest, Seo raised his thin arms to shield his face, a reflex of the broken and the hunted. Dong-Hyuk stepped forward, the barrel of his gun leveled at the boy's head. But then the light from the desk lamp caught the boy's upturned wrist. The Iron Dragon froze. Time seemed to liquefy and stall. On the pale, thin skin of the boy's inner wrist lay a birthmark, a jagged crimson shape that looked like a bird in flight. It was a mark Dong-Hyuk had memorized 20 years ago in the flickering light of a burning shipyard. It was the mark he had traced with his thumb on his younger brother's hand the night the world ended. The gun in Dong-Hyuk's hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 tons. His finger, which had never hesitated on a trigger, went numb. The air left his lungs in a ragged, hollow gasp. He didn't see a stranger. He didn't see an intruder. He saw a ghost. "Sir," one of the guards whispered, sensing the sudden shift in the predator's stance. Dong-Hyuk didn't respond to his men. He didn't acknowledge Minna's frantic prayers. His knees, which had never buckled under the weight of an empire, hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. The weapon clattered away, forgotten. He reached out, his large, scarred hand trembling violently as he hovered his fingers just inches above that crimson mark. "Ji-hoon?" he whispered, using the name he hadn't let pass his lips in 2 decades. The boy looked at him, confused and trembling, but in that moment the Iron Dragon didn't see a threat. He saw the only piece of his soul he thought had burned to ash. The smell of ozone and wet mahogany in the study faded, replaced by the acrid, suffocating stench of burning diesel and salt air. In the hollowed-out silence of Dong-Hyuk's mind, he was no longer a king in a tailored suit. He was 12 years old again, standing on the edge of the Busan shipyard as the world dissolved into orange and black. That night, the sky had been a bruised purple, heavy with the coming storm. Dong-Hyuk had held his 5-year-old brother Ji-hoon's hand so tightly their palms were slick with sweat. They were hiding from the debt collectors who had already taken their parents, hiding in the belly of an old cargo ship that smelled of rust and forgotten things. Dong-Hyuk had promised his brother they were safe. He had pointed to the stars through a crack in the hull and told him that as long as they stayed together, the Iron Dragon of the constellations would watch over them. But the stars were blind. A kerosene lamp, knocked over in the scramble of a sudden raid, had turned their sanctuary into a furnace in seconds. The fire didn't crawl. It leaped, devouring the dry timber and oil-soaked rags of the shipyard. The air became a solid wall of heat that clawed at their lungs. "Don't let go." Dong-Hyuk had screamed, his voice cracking against the roar of the inferno. They had reached the gangplank, the metal beneath their feet groaning and warping. Below them, the black water of the harbor churned, reflecting the dancing flames. A massive support beam, weakened by the heat, gave way with a sound like a mountain snapping. It crashed between them, a pillar of fire and splintering wood that acted as a physical barrier between life and death. For one heartbeat, Dong-Hyuk saw his brother's face through a gap in the smoke. Ji-hoon's eyes weren't filled with anger, only a haunting, quiet confusion. He had reached his small hand through the heat, his wrist exposed, the crimson birthmark vivid against his pale skin, looking like a drop of blood spilled on porcelain. "Hyung!" The boy had cried out, a thin, desperate sound lost to the wind. Dong-Hyuk had lunged into the flames, his skin blistering, his clothes catching fire, but the ship groaned and tilted. A secondary explosion threw the older boy backward, slamming him into the cold, unforgiving concrete of the pier. When he gasped his way back to consciousness, the ship was a skeleton of fire, sinking into the dark depths of the harbor. He had searched for weeks. He had dug through the cooling ash with his bare hands until his fingernails bled. He had interrogated every survivor, every dockworker, every thief in the city, but Ji-hoon was gone, swallowed by the fire or the sea, leaving behind nothing but the phantom sensation of a small hand slipping away. 20 years of power, wealth, and blood had been an attempt to fill that silence. Every man he crushed, every territory he seized, was a frantic effort to build a world where he would never be powerless again. He had convinced himself that he was a monster because a monster wouldn't feel the weight of a ghost's hand. Now, kneeling on the expensive rug of his study, the heat of that night returned to his chest. The boy standing before him, Seo, had the same eyes, the same tilted chin, and that same crimson mark. The guilt that had been a dull ache for 2 decades sharpened into a piercing, agonizing reality. He hadn't just found a child. He had found the piece of himself he had left behind in the fire. The heavy silence in the study was broken only by the sound of Dong-Hyuk's ragged breathing as he remained on his knees. Behind him, his elite security detail stood like statues of stone, their weapons still leveled, their minds racing to process a sight that defied every logic of the underworld. Their boss, a man who had executed lieutenants for far lesser infractions than an unauthorized entry, was currently reaching out to a weeping child with the tenderness of a man touching a holy relic. "Sir." The lead guard, a scarred veteran named Kong, ventured cautiously. "The perimeter is still technically breached. Shall we remove the subjects?" The air in the room suddenly dropped 10 degrees. Dong-Hyuk didn't stand, but his head snapped toward his men, his eyes burning with a cold, lethal intensity that made even Kong take a half step back. The vulnerability that had shattered him seconds ago was replaced by a protective ferocity that was even more terrifying. "If a single one of you even breathes in his direction," Dong-Hyuk said, his voice a low, vibrating warning that echoed off the mahogany walls, "I will ensure you never see the sun again." He turned back to the boy, his expression softening into something unrecognizable. With a slow, deliberate movement, he holstered his weapon and stood up, smoothing the front of his rain-drenched suit. He looked down at Minna, who was still trembling on the floor, her face buried in the rug. "Get up," he commanded, though the sharp edge had left his tone. Minna rose slowly, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. Sir, I. From this moment on, Dong-Hyuk interrupted, turning to address the entire room. This child is the priority of this house. He is not a guest. He is the master of this estate. If he is hungry, the kitchen serves him first. If he is tired, he sleeps in the east wing. If he sheds a single tear because of anyone in this room, you will answer to me personally. The bodyguards exchanged bewildered glances. The east wing was Dong-Hyuk's private quarters, a place where not even his most trusted advisors were permitted to step. Kong, Dong-Hyuk snapped. The guards snapped to attention. Clear the east wing suite. Bring the finest linens. Call the estate physician. Tell him if he isn't here in 20 minutes he's retired. And find out what children eat. Whatever it is, I want it prepared. But boss, Kong stammered, the jackal is moving on the docks tonight. We have a meeting with the syndicate at midnight. You said. Cancel it, Dong-Hyuk said, his gaze returning to Seo, who was still clutching his teddy bear and watching the giant man with cautious wonder. The docks can burn. The syndicate can wait. I have spent 20 years building a kingdom for a ghost. Tonight the ghost came home. He reached out and for a heartbeat it seemed the boy might flinch. But Seo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the way the monster had suddenly become a shield, slowly reached out his small bruised hand. When his tiny fingers brushed against Dong-Hyuk's palm, the Iron Dragon closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to track through the grime on his face. The strongest man in Seoul finally had something to lose, and God help anyone who tried to take it. The east wing of the estate, usually a cold gallery of minimalist art and silent corridors, had been transformed into a surreal sanctuary. The scent of rain and gunpowder had been replaced by the aroma of warm milk and honey, a smell so foreign to Dong-Hyuk's world that it felt like a dream. Despite the frantic preparations of the staff, Seo refused to stay in the sprawling guest suite. He had followed Dong-Hyuk into the master bedroom, clutching his one-eyed bear, his eyes wide as he tracked the giant man who had traded a handgun for a silk robe. Dong-Hyuk, exhausted by the emotional upheaval and the weight of 20 years of ghosts, had eventually fallen into a fitful sleep on the chaise longue at the foot of his bed, unable to leave the boy's side. But the Iron Dragon did not sleep peacefully. In the depths of the night, the shipyard fire returned. In his mind, the room was orange and blistering. He could hear the metal groaning. He could feel the ghost of a small hand slipping through his fingers. His breath came in jagged, desperate gasps, and his hands clawed at the air as he whispered a name that had been around for 2 decades. King, no. Don't let go. A soft weight on his chest pulled him back from the inferno. Dong-Hyuk's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected to see an assassin or a rival. Instead he found Seo standing over him. The boy had climbed onto the chaise, looking tiny against the vastness of the room. With a serious, focused expression, Seo was tucking his tattered teddy bear under Dong-Hyuk's chin. He guards the bad dreams, Seo whispered, his voice small but steady in the moonlight. Mommy says he's a brave bear. He'll fight the fire for you. Dong-Hyuk froze. The most powerful man in Seoul sat up slowly, the worn plush toy falling into his lap. He looked at the bear, its fur matted, its one plastic eye reflecting the moon, and then at the child who was currently patting his scarred hand with a look of profound pity. You're not scared of me? Dong-Hyuk asked, his voice gravelly and low. Seo tilted his head, his eyes traveling to the heavy door where the armed guards stood outside. You have a sad heart, the boy observed with the terrifying clarity of a child. And you dropped your loud stick. Brave people don't need loud sticks to fight dreams. A dry, rusty sound escaped Dong-Hyuk's throat, a laugh he hadn't used in years. It was a jagged, awkward thing, but it softened the hard lines of his face. He reached out and awkwardly patted the boy's head, his large hand nearly covering Seo's entire skull. I suppose I don't, Dong-Hyuk murmured. For the rest of the night, the Iron Dragon sat awake, watching the boy sleep peacefully on the mountain of pillows. He held the tattered teddy bear in his lap like a sacred shield. He realized then that his guards could protect him from bullets and blades, but only this small, fragile ghost could protect him from himself. The man who had spent a lifetime building walls found himself grateful for the one person small enough to climb over them. The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of the east wing, casting long golden bars across the floor. Dong-Hyuk sat in the armchair he hadn't left all night, his gaze fixed on a weathered black-and-white photograph he held in his hand. It was the only item he had ever truly cherished. A picture of two young boys standing in front of a shipyard, their smiles bright and untainted by the world. He looked from the photo to Seo, who was sitting cross-legged on the massive bed, curiously poking at a silver tray of breakfast. The resemblance was no longer just a haunting possibility. It was an undeniable truth etched into every line of the boy's face. Seo, Dong-Hyuk said, his voice softer than the staff had ever heard it. The woman you call mommy. Tell me about her. The boy looked up, a piece of toast forgotten in his hand. She's pretty. He has a laugh that sounds like bells. But she cries sometimes when she looks at the old box under her bed. Dong-Hyuk felt a sharp pull in his chest. The box. Seo nodded. It has a metal bird in it. He told me it belonged to my daddy. She said he went to the stars a long time ago, but he left the bird to watch over us. Dong-Hyuk's breath hitched. He stood up and moved to his wall safe, his fingers trembling as he punched in the code. From the velvet interior he pulled out a small, tarnished silver pin, a crane in flight. It was the twin to the one he had given his brother Ji-hoon the morning of the fire. They were meant to be a pair, a promise that they would always find their way back to one another. He walked over to the bed and held the pin out in his open palm. Seo's eyes went wide. He reached into the small pocket of his denim overalls and pulled out a matching silver crane, its edges blackened by age but its form identical. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of 20 lost years. Dong-Hyuk didn't need a DNA test or a mountain of evidence. The pins, the birthmark, the boy's very soul. Everything pointed to the same miraculous conclusion. Ji-hoon hadn't died in the fire. He had survived, lived a life in the shadows, and though he was gone now, he had sent his son back to the only person who could protect him. Dong-Hyuk sank onto the edge of the bed, the Iron Dragon finally brought to his knees by a truth more powerful than any empire. He realized that Seo wasn't just a reminder of the past. He was a living blood pact, a second chance at the family he thought had been burned to ash. Your father was a hero, Dong-Hyuk whispered, his hand covering the boy's small one, trapping both silver cranes between them. And I am your Hyungnim, your uncle. I have been looking for you for a very long time. Seo didn't fully understand the politics of the underworld or the blood that had been spilled to build the walls around them, but he understood the warmth in the man's eyes. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against Dong-Hyuk's expensive suit jacket. Are you the Iron Dragon from the stars? Seo asked softly. Dong-Hyuk closed his eyes, the tears finally falling freely. I'm just a man who's finally come home. Outside the door, the world of the Mafia was beginning to stir, but inside the room a new kingdom was being born. One built on a foundation of blood, silver, and a promise that would never be broken again. While the sanctuary of the East Wing was filled with the soft whispers of a reunited family, the world outside was growing cold and sharp. In a dimly lit high-rise overlooking the Han River, the atmosphere was far less sacred. Conrad Voss, known in the underworld as the chairman, sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, staring at a high-resolution photograph taken from a long-range drone. The image was grainy, but the content was unmistakable. The Iron Dragon, a man who usually moved like a ghost through the city, was visible through a window. He wasn't holding a weapon or a contract, he was holding a small child's hand. The chairman let out a slow, mocking hiss of breath. For years he had searched for a crack in Seo Dong-Hyuk's armor. He had targeted his shipments, his lieutenants, and his bank accounts, but the dragon had always been untouchable because he had nothing to love. A man with no heart is a man with no weakness. But now the footage showed a different man. One who sat on the edge of a bed and watched a boy sleep with a vulnerability that was practically an invitation to his enemies. So, the chairman murmured, his voice like dry parchment rubbing together. The dragon didn't burn his past to ash after all. He just hid it in the shadows. He turned to his lead enforcer, a man whose face was a map of surgical scars. Dong-Hyuk canceled the syndicate meeting. He skipped the harbor expansion. He's missing out on millions for the sake of a maid's nephew. But look at that birthmark on the boy's wrist. Look at the way Dong-Hyuk guards him. That isn't charity. That's blood. The enforcer nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen. The mansion is a fortress, sir. Even with this information, a frontal assault would be suicide. I don't need to break his walls to destroy him, the chairman replied, a jagged smile twisting his features. I just need to wait for the moment the dragon thinks he's safe. He's forgotten that in our world, a heart isn't a gift, it's a target. We don't take his territory tonight. We take the boy. We take the one thing that makes the Iron Dragon human and then we watch him crawl. As the chairman spoke, he began to sketch a plan on a digital map of the Seo estate. He knew that even the most impenetrable fortress had a rhythm. A moment when the guards shifted, when the laundry was delivered, or when a panicked maid might be forced to make a mistake. Miles away, a shadow detached itself from the trees bordering the Seo mansion, a silent observer marking the patrol patterns. The piece Dong-Hyuk had found was a fragile glass dome, and the hammer was already swinging. The underworld didn't care about reunions or miracles. It only cared about leverage. And as the chairman's men began to load their weapons and synchronize their watches, the Iron Dragon remained blissfully unaware that by finding his soul, he had given his enemies the only weapon capable of killing him. The silence of the Seo estate was shattered not by a scream, but by the hollow metallic clatter of a discarded teddy bear hitting the marble floor. By the time Dong-Hyuk reached the garden pavilion, the shadows had already retreated, leaving behind nothing but a burner phone vibrating on a stone bench. The voice on the other end was a jagged blade of sound. The chairman. The demand was simple and devastating. The Iron Dragon was to come alone to the abandoned shipyard where his life had first broken apart. He was to bring the digital keys to his empire's offshore accounts and the deeds to his northern territories. No guards. No backup. A king's ransom for a small boy's life. When Dong-Hyuk arrived at the shipyard, the air was thick with the scent of salt and rot, a cruel echo of 20 years ago. The chairman stood on a rusted pier, his men forming a wall of black suits and leveled rifles. In the center of the circle sat Eun Seo bound to a chair, his small face bruised and tear-streaked. The sight of the boy's terror ignited a fire in Dong-Hyuk's chest that surpassed any inferno he had ever survived. "You're late, dragon," the chairman sneered, gesturing toward the dark water. "I was beginning to think you'd regained your senses and realized a child isn't worth a kingdom." Dong-Hyuk didn't look at the chairman. His eyes were locked on Eun Seo. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his jacket. The bodyguards flinched, their fingers tightening on their triggers. But Dong-Hyuk didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a sleek, black hardware wallet and a stack of signed documents. "Everything I've built. Every pier, every ship, every cent," Dong-Hyuk said, his voice a low, terrifying calm. "It's all there. Take it and let him walk." "And the gun, Dong-Hyuk," the chairman added, his eyes gleaming with a sick triumph. "A dragon without his claws is just a lizard in the dirt. Throw it in the harbor." Without a second of hesitation, Dong-Hyuk unholstered his custom handgun, the instrument of his power for 2 decades, and tossed it into the black depths of the sea. The splash was a final, heavy punctuation mark on his life as a crime lord. "I don't need a gun to be the man he thinks I am," Dong-Hyuk whispered, looking at the boy. The chairman signaled his men. They grabbed the documents and the digital key, checking the balances with frantic greed. As they realized the sheer scale of the wealth they now held, their formation wavered. The chairman kicked the chair over, leaving Eun Seo to scramble toward his uncle in the dirt. Dong-Hyuk didn't wait. He lunged forward not to strike but to shield. As he gathered the trembling boy into his arms, he felt the cold realization that he was now an unarmed man in a den of wolves. He had traded his empire for a soul, and as the chairman raised his own weapon to finish the job, Dong-Hyuk realized he had never been more powerful than he was in that moment, protecting the only thing in the world that truly belonged to him. The roar of the harbor wind was the only sound that followed the chairman's downfall. When the rival syndicate had moved to strike the unarmed dragon, they had forgotten one fundamental truth. A man who has found a reason to live is far more dangerous than a man who has accepted his death. Dong-Hyuk's loyalists, led by Kong, had ignored his orders to stay away, descending on the shipyard like a vengeful storm the moment the child was secure. In the chaos that followed, the Iron Dragon didn't look back at the empire he was losing. He only looked down at the boy trembling in his arms. Weeks later, the sprawling, cold fortress in the heart of Seoul stood empty. The marble floors that had once echoed with the footsteps of assassins were silent, the minimalist art sold, and the heavy iron gates locked for the last time. Seo Dong-Hyuk had signed away the last of his holdings, dismantling the Iron Dragon, piece by piece until nothing remained but a man and his name. The new house was different. It was a modest villa on the outskirts of Jeju, overlooking a sea that no longer smelled of diesel and secrets. Here the air was sweet with the scent of citrus trees and salt spray. There were no armed guards at the perimeter, no red laser sights in the hallways, and no rules about forbidden guests. On a quiet afternoon, Min-ah stood on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. She saw Eun-seo running through the tall grass, his laughter a bright, clear bell that shattered the heavy silence Dong-Hyuk had lived in for 20 years. Following close behind the boy was Dong-Hyuk himself, his sleeves rolled up, his face devoid of the sharp, predatory tension that had once been his mask. He stopped to pick up a tattered, one-eyed teddy bear that Eun-seo had dropped in his excitement. He brushed the dirt off its fur with a tenderness that would have shocked his former enemies. In this new kingdom, power wasn't measured by the lives he could take, but by the life he had saved. Dong-Hyuk looked at the silver crane pin pinned to his lapel, then at the identical one glinting on Eun-seo's small jacket. The Iron Dragon was gone, replaced by a guardian who finally understood that a house only becomes a home when there is someone inside worth protecting. As the stars began to poke through the bruised purple of the twilight, Dong-Hyuk reached out and took Eun-seo's hand. The crimson birthmark on the boy's wrist caught the fading light, a permanent reminder of a brother lost and a family found. They walked toward the house together, where the lights were warm and the table was set for three. The fire from the shipyard had finally burned itself out, leaving behind something far stronger than iron. A promise, a legacy, and a love that had survived the dark. Seo Dong-Hyuk had lost an empire, but as he heard Eun-seo call out the word uncle, he knew he had finally become a king. The story of the boy from the fire ended there, but the life of the man who came home was just beginning.